Hi, let me ask you something. When you think about the very beginnings of rock and roll music, way back in the 1950s, what sort of image comes into your mind? Now, maybe all that stuff happened so long ago that you don't really have any image ready at all. Or maybe you just have a very vague picture, loosely based on Danny Zuko from Grease or Arthur Fonzarelli from Happy Days. If you do have a more specific picture in mind, though, the chances are pretty good that what you're picturing is a singer. Maybe holding a guitar or playing the piano, and very likely with a memorable hairstyle. It could be a black guy or a white guy that you're picturing, but it's almost certainly a guy. Unless maybe your stereotypical picture of early rock and roll is Wanda Jackson, in which case, well, we should hang out. And it's probably just one guy, standing in front of a band, not a whole group of singers. In a way, this is a fairly accurate picture. A decent number of the key early figures in rock and roll did more or less fit that description. The problem here is that if you had actually been a teenager growing up in the 1950s, especially if you happened to be living in a coastal US city, you might very well have had a completely different picture of what rock and roll looked like. Something more like this. Or maybe this. Or this. Or possibly even this. Or just conceivably, this. Since the 1960s, it's been typical to at least implicitly write vocal groups like these out of the story of rock and roll, instead giving them other labels like oldies or doo-wop, a term that pops up in the backup vocals of a few songs from the 1950s but wasn't used as a genre name until later on. The blame for this can, I'm afraid, be placed pretty squarely on the world of rock music, by which I mean the genre that popped up in the mid-1960s with acts like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Bob Dylan, and which continued to be a major force in music, at least through the 1990s. Rock is one of the children of rock and roll, but its dedicatees have had an unfortunate tendency to think of it as an only child, and to devalue the rock and roll music that seems to be less closely related to it. This is a particularly iffy thing, because of all rock and roll's children, rock is by far the whitest, and it's at least a contender for the malest. It's also just kind of missing the point. One of the coolest things about rock and roll in its early days is that it wasn't really a musical genre at all. It was a cultural phenomenon that embraced and tied together a whole bunch of different musical styles that came from different places, represented different audiences, and had different but related historical and cultural backgrounds. Some aspects of this phenomenon, including the idea of music with interracial marketability, an assertive youth market with values that went against the common wisdom of the older generation, and even the name rock and roll itself, were things that had been stewing for quite some time, at least since the swing explosion of the late 1930s. That doesn't mean that there was nothing new about rock and roll, though. The swing craze had happened in the context of the Depression-era music industry, in which just 4 record labels, 4 radio networks, and 1 licensing organization were able to wield a tremendous amount of control over what people heard, or didn't hear. World War II eroded this system in a whole bunch of ways that I'll have to get into in a different episode. Then, after the war, several factors, including the availability of tape recorders and new, cheaper, and less fragile records made from vinyl, which is a kind of plastic, instead of shellac, which is made from resin secreted by an insect, altered the playing field even more. By the early 1950s, there was an immense and growing field of small, independent record labels, many of them operating on an extremely modest scale out of houses or storefronts. These ranged from the sincere pet projects of aficionados who wanted to support the music they loved and share it with the world, to what were essentially just convenient places for gangsters to launder their money. Most were somewhere in between. But because of similar trends that were happening in radio, and because America was just apparently in a particularly eclectic mood, practically any of them could potentially have a big hit. Now, don't get me wrong here. There was plenty wrong with America in the 1950s. Although the civil rights movement was finally starting to make some real strides, This progress was, not unlike today, being met with a backlash that was both astoundingly violent and tragically effective in its influence on cowardly media executives. Meanwhile, women, who had attained unprecedented levels of independence, freedom, and influence during the war years, were also being faced with a backlash that was so pervasive that even fashion trends seemed intent on reinforcing so-called traditional gender roles. Despite all that, though, the 1950s were a marvelously kooky and unpredictable time for the American music industry, when anything from mambos and calypsos to abbreviated legwear enthusiasts and colorful monocular airborne people-eating unicorns could become a sensation overnight. There's perhaps no better or more consequential example of this than that of 5 young girls from Harlem who wrote a song to poke fun at their school teacher and somehow ended up ushering in a new genre of music that would define an era and dominate the pop charts for a decade. Of course, I'm talking about Mr. Lee by the Bobbettes. As I mentioned a moment ago, vocal groups played a much larger role in the original phenomenon of rock and roll than is usually acknowledged. You could actually say pretty much the same thing about the whole history of American music culture, especially African American music culture. Most recorded popular music includes some kind of instruments. Nearly all recorded popular music, in fact. And so it's easy to imagine that the same is true of what doesn't get recorded. The thing about musical instruments, though, is that they're often really expensive, and they require a lot of time and effort to learn how to play well. Singing, on the other hand, uses an instrument that most people have pre-installed for free, and it's something many people learn to do in their experiences at church, at school, or just being alive. So, for many people, especially younger people who want to get into this whole music thing but don't necessarily have so much time or money to invest, the best option has often been to just get together and sing. This is the kind of thing that happens mostly off the record. So even though we know people were singing together, we don't necessarily know what they were singing or what it sounded like. There are a few early recordings of white vocal groups and of African American religious groups, but when it comes to African American secular music especially, these early days are still pretty much shrouded in mystery. The style known as barbershop does have its origins in what at least some African American vocal groups were doing in the early 20th century. But pretty much all the barbershop music we have access to today is just a copy of a copy of a copy, so it can't tell us all that much about what was really going on. By the late 1920s or so, though, there were a few groups incorporating elements of jazz and blues into a more or less barbershop-y framework, and some of these actually got recorded. In 1939, one of these groups, the Ink Spots, recorded a sentimental ballad called If I Didn't Care. It struck such a chord that it became the top song of the entire decade, and with 19 million copies sold, it's still pretty high up on the list of the top singles of all time. This tremendous success naturally got the attention of the music industry, and African American vocal groups like the Ink Spots, the Mills Brothers, and the Delta Rhythm Boys would be a mainstay throughout the 1940s. Meanwhile, though, some of the younger groups of kids singing together on street corners were coming up with a whole new strategy to more closely emulate the sound of the swing and rhythm and blues groups they liked. Instead of all singing together in rich harmonies, they started to take on separate instrumental roles, supporting the lead vocal in rhythmic vocalizations and nonsense syllables. The beginnings of the style that's now commonly known as Doo-Wop. For a few years this went on under the radar, but then in 1951 a group called Billy Ward and His Dominoes came out with a song called 60-Minute Man. Musically, it was probably closer to the Ink Spots than to what kids on street corners were doing, but it was light, funny, and filled with the kind of barely below the surface sexual double entendre that makes teenagers want to hide it under their mattresses. This appeal to young people unexpectedly drove the song to number 1 on the R&B chart, and then, even more surprisingly, to number 17 on the pop chart. That teenagers could have the buying power to drive a hit single like this, and that a song with the right appeal could motivate both black and white teenagers to buy it in large numbers, were revelations that the music industry couldn't afford to ignore. The tidal wave of songs from young black vocal groups that ensued would be the earliest and, for many, the most memorable flowering of the rock and roll phenomenon. As exciting as all this is, though, it can look a lot like a boys' club up to this point. Boys tended to have a lot more free rein for activities like hanging out on street corners, and the fact that men controlled the music industry probably didn't hurt either, but this doesn't mean that girls and women weren't doing a lot of singing too. There had been a string of successful white female vocal groups active since the 1930s, most notably the surprisingly jazzy Boswell sisters, who did vocal renditions of songs by Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. The disarmingly subversive Andrews sisters, who claimed to have absolutely no idea that one of their biggest hit songs was actually about oral sex. And the aggressively unthreatening Chordettes, whose barbershop-y sound is still one of the ultimate icons of America in the 1950s. Black women, however, were strikingly underrepresented in this arena. The music industry tends to be pretty heartless, even at its best, but it was an especially harsh place for women in the 1950s. There was a prevalent idea that men would find other men to be more relatable, whereas women would see other women as a threat and therefore would also prefer to listen to male artists. In about 1955, Wanda Jackson says that she was told flat out by Capitol Records executive Ken Nelson that girls don't sell records. As a side note, singer and rapper Alicia Dixon says that her group Mystique was repeatedly told by record executives that black girls don't sell records. An especially astonishing thing to say when you consider how many millions of records had been sold by black girls up to that point. Despite this extra difficulty, some movement was starting to happen. On the religious side of things, gospel music, a style that had gotten its start in small African-American Pentecostal churches, was an area where the playing field was slightly more level for women. In the early 1950s, gospel was exploding in popularity and influence, ultimately leading to the creation of what we now call soul music. Several all-female groups, most notably the uncompromising Davis Sisters of Philadelphia, were among the most widely emulated gospel acts. Meanwhile, Ruth Brown and Laverne Baker, both artists on New York's Atlantic Records, made a significant impact from the early 50s on with music that's noticeably light on markers of traditional femininity. Although their music was more on the adult side of things that tends to be remembered more as rhythm and blues than rock and roll, they definitely set some very significant precedents. Then, in 1954, a group from Los Angeles called Shirley Gunter and the Queens released Oop Shoop, a song that sounded a lot like what Laverne Baker was doing, but with the addition of nonsense backing vocals. It reached number 8 on the R&B chart, making it the first hit of the girl group era. 2 years later, another group called the Teen Queens had an even bigger hit, reaching number 3 on the R&B chart with Eddie My Love, a song that may sound somewhat familiar to fans of the musical Grease. Inspired by these successes, 2 junior high school students named Rether Dixon and Emma Pout started to gather with friends they knew from their church choir and school glee club to sing popular songs. At first, this was just something they did for fun, but soon they started to realize they were getting good and formed the Harlem Queens, along with Helen Gathers, Laura Webb, and Janie Pout, Emma's little sister. They started to take their act to open mics, including the amateur night at the Apollo Theater, which has jump-started so many careers that it may be the most important regular event in all of music history. These appearances soon brought them to the attention of Atlantic Records co-founder Ahmet Ertegun, who was amazed that a group of girls aged 11 to 15 could produce such a mature sound. He asked the Queens if they had any original material, and they responded with a song they had written together to poke fun at one of their teachers. Some sources say their principal, Mr. Lee. He liked it, but asked if they could rework it as a love song to make it more marketable. Then, rechristened the Bobbettes, they entered the studio with bandleader Reggie Obrecht and legendary tenor saxophonist King Curtis, and together laid down their reworked version of Mr. Lee, along with its more musically eccentric Latin-tinged B-side, Look at the Stars. Apparently, they didn't think too much of this at first. A whole lot of records got made, and the vast majority of them went nowhere. so they just went on with their regular lives. Emma Powell later said that when she first heard the song playing from a record store on her way home from school on the day of her junior high graduation, at first she didn't even realize it was her own voice she was hearing. It was, and Mr. Lee was well on its way to becoming one of the signature hits of 1957. It ultimately sold more than 2 million copies, reaching number 1 on the R&B chart and number 7 on the pop chart, the first song by a group of African American women to even come close to breaking the top 10. Mr. Lee, with its hard-driving R&B instrumentation and signature vocal hiccup, is an extremely fun song to listen to, largely because of how much fun the Bobbettes seem to be having singing it. It has a raucous energy and freewheeling spontaneity that pretty much speak for themselves, but I think there are a few things that are worth pointing out about it. One thing is that they wrote it themselves. One of the darkest aspects of the world of girl groups is the degree to which it was dominated by invariably male producers and record executives, who not only told groups what to sing, but often dealt with their very existence in a shockingly cavalier manner. Just for one example, Berry Gordy of Motown Records apparently bet the Marvelettes in a poker game, and lost. Several girl groups, including the Marvelettes, had their first success with a self-written song, but then once they were in the system were forced to conform and sing what they were told to sing. The Bobettes, though, were unique among all the successful girl groups of the era in having either written or at least had a hand in writing the majority of songs they released. This was thanks in part to Ahmet Ertegun, who was not an altogether typical record executive, and who recognized their talents as songwriters as well as performers early on. Another thing to notice is how funny it is. It's worth remembering that Mr. Lee, as it was originally written, was explicitly a piece of comedy. The original lyrics, which unfortunately I can't find, apparently provided a pretty harsh description of the titular character, describing him as, among other things, the ugliest teacher you ever did see. It's almost ubiquitous among sources I've looked at to say that they hated Mr. Lee and wrote the song to ruthlessly mock him, but they adamantly denied this, saying that he was someone they liked to joke around with and that he was flattered by the tribute. One anecdote related by Rether Dixon, in which the real Mr. Lee heard the song on the radio and immediately called the girls out of class to make sure someone hadn't stolen it from them, seems like a pretty good indication that they were telling the truth. Although the Bobettes technically followed Ertegun's instruction to rework the song, the result has got to be one of the least romantically tinged love songs ever created. Instead, it overflows with a delightfully absurd energy that demonstrates the group's talents as musical comedians, even though most of the explicit comedy has been removed. This is an example of the kind of thing we miss out on when we only know old music from recordings. Bits, sketches, and pratfalls were a big part of the Bobettes' live performances, and a big part of their appeal, but only echoes of this side of the group show up on their recordings. One exception is I Shot Mr. Lee, a musically similar follow-up song the group recorded 2 years later. Featuring a rousing chorus of "Help, help, murder police, the girl's after me with a gun," and closing with jovial repetitions of "Shot him in the head, boom, boom, whoa." This is a piece of dark comedy to rival pretty much anything from the 1950s, and it speaks volumes about the Bobettes' expectation-bucking sensibility. Like Mr. Lee, it was written by the whole group together, and it was something they felt strongly enough about that they ended their relationship with Atlantic Records when the label, perhaps understandably, declined to release it. Given this penchant, it's probably no coincidence that several of the Bobettes could be heard a few years later as members of Dr. Strangelove and the Fallouts in the exuberantly apocalyptic movie tie-in novelty track, Love That Bomb. It's fair to say that the Bobettes were unique among girl groups in several ways, but it was their success that opened the doors to a girl group explosion that, for many listeners, defined the sound of the late 50s and early 60s. Two hits of the following year, Maybe, a heart-wrenching torch song by fellow New Yorkers the Chantels, and I Met Him on a Sunday, a girl power breakup solidarity song by the New Jerseyite Shirelles, would set the tone and themes that are most familiar from the girl group era. But the manic zaniness and hard-driving R&B style of the Bobettes never really went away, and can be heard in songs from later girl groups including the Velvettes, the Dixie Cups, and the Tammies. As for the Bobettes themselves, they kept going well into the 1970s, and although they never had another big hit like Mr. Lee, they continued to have success as a live act on the R&B and oldies circuits. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say about rock and roll, vocal groups, the Bobettes, and Mr. Lee, and I especially hope that you enjoy the music. I'll be back again soon with something completely different. Until then, stay healthy and happy, and don't forget to listen to some music now and then.